Steering wheel down, seats all the way back. Good evening, everybody. I was going to go fishing off one of these Florida canals, and I actually started for a few minutes, but I'm not going to catch anything. So while I wait for my daughter to be done her activity, I'm going to do a vlog and summarize in shorter format what is the most atrocious judgment coming out of Canada, coming out of Alberta. It was first reported in the post-millennial. A judge in Alberta lifting an injunction that had been issued to prevent a 27-year-old woman suffering from autism and apparently ADHD from choosing to end her life under Justin Trudeau's very progressive liberal medical assistance in dying, MAIDs. That's the euphemism up in Canada now for euthanasia, for what other eras used to call mercy killings. For those who don't know, this goes back to 2016. A Supreme Court decision came out in Canada that said denying the right to die with dignity to those who were terminally ill violated people's constitutional rights. And so the Supreme Court came out and said, you cannot deny the right to die with dignity to people who are terminally ill. The Liberal government puts up some legislation so that they could codify this declaration from the Supreme Court and amend the criminal code so that doctors who administer death, euthanasia, would not be liable for murder. And as they're debating this bill to say, yes, people who are suffering from terminal illness from which there's no prospect of getting better should not be denied the right to end their own lives with dignity or with assistance from doctors if they're incapable of doing it. As they're debating this piece of legislation, some liberal had the good idea of saying, yeah, we don't want to deny this constitutional right to the mentally ill. We should also allow the mentally ill who are not suffering from a terminal illness, from an illness from which death is the necessary result, we should allow them the right to kill themselves as well. There was some debate going back and forth, and they decided to add this into the bill, but provide an exclusion, a temporary exclusion, the sunset clause, a 3-year period or a 4-year period before which this provision would come into effect. And that is to say that when the sunset clause took effect, when this restriction faded into the sunset, the mentally ill under Canada's euthanasia laws would be allowed to end their lives, not as a result of terminal illness, but as a result of mental illness. That sunset clause has since been extended to March 2024. It was supposed to expire in 2023. And from what I understand, it's now been extended again until 2027. But that hasn't prevented Canada from becoming the euthanasia capital of the world. In 2022, 13,300 Canadians ended their lives. State-sanctioned assistance of death. Some people might call it state-sanctioned murder when we understand how flippantly and willy-nilly euthanasia had been administered in Canada. In Quebec, at one point in time, the Daily Mail broke the article. Euthanasia, state-sanctioned ending of life, medical assistance in dying, MAIDs, mercy killing, was the number 3 cause of death in the province. And when that story broke, the Quebec government's like, whoa, we better pull this back a little bit. It's starting to look like it's not necessarily allowing people to die with dignity, but allowing the government to kill with impunity. In 2022, 13,000 and change people died under the medical assistance in dying program. 4.1% of all death in Canada government administered. In 2021, it was 10,064. I couldn't believe that number when my brother, Lion Advocacy on Twitter, first reported it. And since then, I've been somewhat incensed about the flippant, willy-nilly administration of death in Canada. They want to extend it to the mentally ill. That restriction is going to remain in effect until 2027. They're talking about administering it to minors who can consent, potentially to minors who cannot consent, and in which case you're basically allowing parents to decide. But don't worry, they have checks and balances, right? They have doctors who are not going to authorize medical assistance in dying, state-sanctioned murder, unless it's warranted, right? Wrong. Because we have had multiple cases in Canada, before we get to the judgment that I'm going to talk about now. We've had multiple cases where individuals have been offered death when they were not suffering from anything terminal. There was a veteran who called Veteran Affairs suffering from PTSD. He was offered death. Have you thought about killing yourself? There was a woman who suffered from multiple chemical sensitivity in Ontario, I believe. MCS. It's another word for severe allergies, multiple chemical sensitivity. She couldn't find adequate housing because the Canadian healthcare system, the socialized healthcare system, is so good. It's equality for all. It's equal crap for all. She couldn't find adequate housing, so she chose death, and the government administered her death. The woman who was involved in that Simon's ad, Beauty in Life or Beauty in Everything or Everything is Beauty, Simon's, a clothing company out of Quebec, decided to make an homage to this woman who allegedly chose death to end her suffering. It ended up that she suffered from a disease that was not a terminal illness, and that after she was put to death by the government, emerged evidence that she didn't want to end her life, but she felt that she was falling through the cracks. You could look all of this up. There have been people who have been put to death under the euthanasia regime in Canada who were not terminally ill, and it was seen basically as a cost-saving measure for the government. CBC News ran an article, CBC News, the state-funded Pravda, ran an article a few years ago saying euthanasia, Canada's at the forefront of it, but don't worry, it's not going to cost the system more money. It might actually save the system money. No crap, CBC. That's the problem, not a feature. When it becomes cheaper to kill your citizens than to treat your citizens in a socialized healthcare system that already cannot provide for the citizens, yeah, it's going to be a reflex for the government to euthanize, to suggest death as opposed to treatment because it's cheaper. Kayla Pollock, the woman that I interviewed a few weeks ago, who was paralyzed, rendered a quadriplegic by a certain jab, the name shall not be mentioned, after she got paralyzed with transverse myelitis, couldn't really get the appropriate healthcare that she needed from the system, couldn't get the needed rehabilitation that she needed from the system, was offered death by the government that paralyzed her, offered her death. Hey, we're not going to treat you. Your life is going to be pretty miserable under what we can provide to you under the universal healthcare plan. Have you thought about killing yourself? Luckily, she hasn't. Luckily, she didn't accept that offer, and luckily the community has gotten together to raise funds for her so she can live with dignity instead of being euthanized by a government that can't provide for her after having paralyzed her with their mandates and with their coercion. Set that aside. The most recent decision coming out of Alberta, reported by the Post Millennial, a judge lifted an injunction preventing a 27-year-old woman from ending her own life. Her father filed the injunction because this woman, 27 years old, his daughter, finally found doctors to approve her request to die. There was no evidence submitted to the court that she was suffering from any terminal illness. The evidence submitted to the court, and I had to verify it on my own to make sure that the article was accurate. The judge accepted as evidence that the 27-year-old woman suffered from autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, I believe, but certainly autism, that she suffered certain cognitive impairments or cognitive inabilities as a result of her autism, that she did not submit any evidence of any terminal illness or illness that she was suffering from. She had applied 2 times before for medical assistance in dying and had a panel of 2 judges split decision twice before. One said, yeah, we'll euthanize you. The other one said, no, you're not suffering from anything that could warrant you suiciding yourself. A second panel of 2 doctors also split. Third time's a charm. She gets around to it. She found 2 doctors willing, eager to take a young woman's life, a young woman who suffers from certain mental issues as per the judgment itself. And I came out and I said, this judgment is inexplicably horrendous. It's atrocious. I'm just going to get the highlights so that I can read it to you. It's inexplicably atrocious in it. Paragraph 33, the judge basically comes to the conclusion that these are medical decisions. The court can't come and intervene because that would be intervening in the medical decisions between a patient and doctors. How then is anyone supposed to verify the exemption under the criminal code if the courts can never get involved? Reading from the decision, paragraph 38, later in these reasons, I explain that the court cannot review a MAID applicant's decision-making or the clinical judgment of the doctors and nurse practitioners involved in assessing an applicant's suitability for medical assistance in dying. They say MAID. It's a beautiful euphemism. The inability to review the clinical judgment of the professionals making medical assistance in dying assessments precludes the court from going behind the medical assessments to question whether MV, that's the name of the woman because there's a publication ban in this, because justice dies in darkness, liberty dies in darkness, democracy dies in darkness. And in so many cases, and too many cases coming out of Canada and elsewhere, publication bans, so that we can't know who the doctors are, so that we can't know what the hospitals are, so that we don't know who the plaintiffs are. Inability to review the clinical judgment of the professionals making MAID assessments precludes the court from going behind the medical assessments to question whether MV's sole condition is mental illness or disability. You know what you're saying there, Judge? You're unable to go determine whether or not it's medical assistance in dying or murder, that the exclusion, the immunity given in the criminal code to doctors who assist after assessing and awarding it, you'll never be able to determine if it's actual bona fide medical assistance in dying or bona fide murder. MV was diagnosed on February 25, 2016 with autism spectrum disorder. Her doctor indicated in his diagnosis that she did not have any associated intellectual development or speech disorder. Sounds good, so she's cognitively all there. However, he specified that she suffered from the following associated behavioral disorders. Level 1, social communication disorder severity, supports needed. Level 2, restrictive repetitive behavior severity, substantial supports needed. WV deposed that he and PS, those are the parents, have been MV's de facto guardians since she came of age. MV is 27 years old and lives in their basement. MV has never worked except for odd jobs for her parents and a brief stint for Elections Canada during an election. So the woman who has been authorized by two medical professionals, I guess, to end her own life, no evidence that she suffers from any terminal illness. There is evidence that she suffers from some sort of cognitive impairments as a result of her autism, and she's been authorized to kill herself, and a judge lifted the injunction preventing her from doing so, although he stayed for 30 days so the father and the mother can take other court proceedings. It's atrocious. At paragraph 55, they explain the process. WV deposed that MV applied for MAID on 2 occasions. The date of her first MAID application is not in evidence. Her first application for MAID was denied because, quote, one physician approved and one did not, end quote. Dr. P's counsel confirmed that MV made 2 MAID applications. Paragraph 56, MV made a second application for MAID in 2023. Again, one doctor determined her to be eligible and the other did not. AHS, that's Alberta Health Services, permitted her to obtain a third assessment to break the tie. The doctor selected to break the tie, Dr. P, is the same doctor who previously, in the context of her first MAID application, found her to be eligible. MV advised WV on December 13, 2023 that she had been approved for MAID and that her date of death was scheduled for January 19, 2024. WV and PS developed a family plan for MV's care and personal development in the hopes of persuading MV not to proceed with MAID. MV subsequently rescheduled her date of death to February 1, 2024. Her death was prevented by the interim injunction issued by Justice Belzile on January 31, 2024. A date of death. You're planning your date of death the way people plan birthdays. This is what Canada has come to. What was supposed to be a system intended to prevent pain and suffering for terminally ill people for whom death is imminent and irreversible has now turned into something where people can willy-nilly, people with cognitive impairments, people with mental disorders can willy-nilly decide to take their own lives, and if they can find 2 sick doctors or 2 sick nurse practitioners to approve it, they can end their lives and there's no judicial oversight. It is legalized, state-sanctioned murder. It's absurd. It's atrocious. It's what happens with a society when it ceases to value the beauty of life. And I'm not against euthanasia at all. I have seen people suffer through cancer. I understand when it's necessary. I understand when people can decide to do it before they fall into an irreversible state of incapacity where they will not be able to do it afterwards. I understand that. But we have gone from that to just willy-nilly ending the lives of people because the system cannot take care of them anymore. And at the same time that you have the government ending people's lives, promoting life-ending procedures for pregnant women, you have the government passing legislation that basically presumes organ donation consent. And what can possibly go wrong when you have vulnerable, mentally ill people who it is cheaper to kill than to treat, and then you get to harvest their organs after you end their lives? What could possibly go wrong? What incentive could the government possibly have to grotesquely abuse this system? This is liberal progressivism. I have said it now, I'm going to make a trend. Liberals in Canada are the modern day Nazis. There is no other way to describe it. Hitler called it mercy killings. They would go kill the handicapped. They would kill the mentally ill. They would call it mercy killings because it was for the betterment of society. Justin Trudeau just gave it another euphemism, medical assistance in dying, and they want to expand it to young people who can't consent, to the mentally ill, to drug addicts. They want to expand it to anybody who on a bad day says, yes, please end my life. It's cheaper for the government. It saves the government money, and maybe they can even recoup some of that money by collecting and harvesting those organs of the people that they just put to death. It's disgusting. I am on a mission to put it on blast so that the rest of the world knows what hell is being ushered in Canada and can spread to the rest of the world. If you like what I do, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, yada, yada, yada. Now you know your vlog. Peace out.